The wind carries secrets across the steppes that no chronicle dares to whisper, and in the dying light of empire, where shadows grow longer than the reach of any Khan's sword, there lies a truth so dangerous that it was buried deeper than the bones of conquered kings. Listen closely, for what you're about to hear has been scraped from the margins of forbidden texts, gathered from the trembling lips of dying shamans, and pieced together from fragments that emperors tried to burn but could never quite destroy. In the 13th year of the reign of Temujin, who the world would come to know as Genghis Khan, when the Mongol hordes stretched like a plague of locusts from the Gobi to the gates of Khwarezmia, there existed a son whose name was spoken only in whispers, if it was spoken at all. Not Yochi, the eldest, whose legitimacy hung like morning mist over disputed bloodlines. Not Urgadai, whose cunning mind would one day inherit an empire. Not Tolui, the fierce warrior who drank victory like fermented mare's milk. This was the fourth son, the forgotten one, the shadow who walked behind shadows. They called him Khasa the Silent, though that was not the name given to him at birth. His true name died with him, erased so thoroughly from the earth that even the stones have forgotten how to pronounce it. But in the final moments before dawn breaks over this tale, you will understand why his brothers feared him more than they feared death itself, and why the weapon he forged in secrecy would change not just the course of battle, but the very nature of empire. The boy had been born small, arriving into this world during a winter so harsh that the shamans declared it a bad omen. While his brothers grew tall and broad like their father, muscles rippling beneath skin kissed by wind and war, Khasa remained slight, his frame more suited to the careful work of fletchers and bowmakers than to the brutal dance of mounted combat. The great Khan looked upon him with the same distant disappointment one might reserve for a blade that refused to hold its edge. Useful, perhaps, for cutting leather, but hardly worthy of cleaving through the armor of enemies. And perhaps, if you are listening carefully to these words, if you can feel the weight of what approaches like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon, you should pause now and consider whether some stories are meant to remain buried, whether some truths are too sharp for the safety of those who would hold them. Yet Khasa possessed something his brothers lacked, something that burned behind his dark eyes like banked coals, waiting for the breath of wind that would ignite them into consuming flame. He watched, he studied, while Jochi practiced his sword work and Urgadai counted tribute and Tolui led raids against the Merkits. Khasa spent his days among the weapon makers and his nights sketching designs by firelight, his fingers stained with ink and charcoal, his mind turning over possibilities like water flowing around stones. The traditional Mongol bow was already a marvel of engineering, a composite weapon of horn and sinew and wood that could drive an arrow through chain mail at distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. But Khasa saw its limitations the way a master craftsman sees the flaws in what others consider perfection. The draw length was restricted by the mounted archer's position, the power constrained by the need for speed and mobility. What if, he wondered during the long watches of the night, what if those constraints could be broken? He began his work in secret, commandeering a corner of an abandoned storage yurt where the scent of old leather and rust provided cover for his experiments. Using wood harvested from the forests beyond the Onon River, horn carefully carved from the skulls of prize cattle, and sinew treated with methods he learned from an ancient bowyer who spoke in riddles and demanded payment in silver, Khasa began constructing something that had never existed before. The bow he created was longer than any Mongol had ever drawn, its limbs curved in a way that captured and stored energy like a coiled serpent preparing to strike. But length alone was not his innovation. Through careful manipulation of the composite layers, through adjustments to the ratios of horn to wood to sinew, through modifications to the grip and the knocking point that required the archer to draw not to the cheek, but to the ear, Qaisar had created a weapon that could launch arrows with twice the velocity and 3 times the range of any bow in the Mongol arsenal. The first time he tested it, the arrow disappeared into the twilight sky and never came down where any man could find it. The second time, he aimed at a target 500 paces distant and watched his shaft punch through wood and iron as if they were made of parchment. But it was the third test that changed everything, when he discovered that his weapon could be used not just by mounted archers, but by foot soldiers positioned on high ground, raining death from distances so great that enemies would fall without ever seeing who had killed them. For months he practiced in solitude, his fingers bleeding from the unfamiliar draw weight, his shoulders burning with the strain of mastering a technique that no warrior had ever attempted. He learned to account for wind patterns across impossible distances, to calculate the arc of arrows that flew higher and farther than eagles, and slowly, carefully, he began to recruit others to his cause. The first was Berte's nephew, a young archer whose skill with the traditional bow had already attracted attention from the Khan's generals. Then came a veteran of the Khwarezmian campaigns, a man whose loyalty was absolute, but whose ambition had been overlooked by commanders who valued loudness over precision. One by one, Qaisar gathered a small band of warriors who shared his vision of warfare transformed, men who could see past the glory of mounted charges to embrace the cold mathematics of death delivered from afar. They trained in the pre-dawn hours when the camp still slept, their practice sessions hidden by morning mist and the sound of horses being watered. They developed new formations, new tactics, new ways of thinking about the relationship between ground and sky, between hunter and prey. And all the while, rumors began to spread through the camp like smoke from a hidden fire, whispers of strange sounds heard in the darkness, of arrows found embedded in distant hills, of the fourth son spending too much time among the weapon makers and not enough time proving his worth in battle. The great Khan heard these rumors as he heard all things that passed between the felt walls of his empire, but like many fathers, he saw in his youngest son only what he expected to see, a boy playing with toys, a weakling seeking to compensate for his physical limitations through clever tricks and elaborate projects. When Qaisar finally approached his father with a request to demonstrate his creation, Genghis Khan dismissed him with the casual indifference of a man who had more pressing concerns than the fantasies of a son who had never proven himself worthy of attention. It was Tolui who changed everything. The third son, fierce and proud, had grown tired of hearing whispered jokes about his younger brother's strange obsessions. One evening, as the setting sun painted the steppes the color of dried blood, he confronted Qaisar outside the weapon-maker's quarter and demanded to see what had been occupying so much of the forgotten son's time. What happened next would be remembered by witnesses for the rest of their lives, though none would ever speak of it publicly. Qaisar led Tolui to a rise overlooking the camp, where targets had been arranged at distances that seemed impossible for any bow to reach. Without ceremony, without boasting or explanation, he drew his strange weapon and began to shoot. The first arrow struck a shield at 400 paces, the impact so violent that the bronze facing cracked like ice. The second punched through a mail shirt at 500 paces, emerging from the other side with enough force to bury itself in the earth beyond. The third, launched at a distance of nearly 700 paces, found its mark in the center of a wooden target, with a sound like thunder rolling across the steppes. Tolui stood in silence for a long moment, his face pale despite the evening heat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of awe and something darker. Something that tasted of fear and envy, and the bitter recognition that the balance of power among the Khan's sons had just shifted in ways that could not be undone. "Father must see this," he whispered. But even as he spoke the words, both brothers understood that what they had witnessed was too dangerous for the simple clarity of demonstration. This was not merely a new weapon. It was a fundamental change in the nature of warfare itself, a development that would render obsolete every military doctrine the Mongols had ever known. In the wrong hands, it could topple empires. In the right hands, it could create them. The opportunity to prove the weapon's worth came sooner than anyone expected. Word reached the camp that a coalition of Chinese warlords, backed by Jin dynasty gold and expertise, had assembled an army near the Keralan River. Their force was formidable, anchored by heavily armored cavalry and protected by formations of crossbowmen whose bolts could punch through Mongol leather at ranges that had previously given the steppe warriors decisive advantages. Traditional tactics would be costly, perhaps disastrously so. The great Khan called a council of war, and for the first time in his life, Khazar found himself invited to attend. The general spoke of flanking maneuvers and feigned retreats, of drawing the enemy into terrain favorable for mounted charges. They discussed the timing of attacks, the positioning of reserves, the logistical challenges of maintaining pressure against a well-supplied force fighting on ground of their own choosing. And through it all, Khazar remained silent, his strange bow across his knees, waiting for the moment when words would give way to desperate necessity. That moment came when Subutai, the greatest of the Khan's generals, concluded his assessment with the frank admission that victory would require accepting casualties on a scale the Mongols had rarely endured. The Chinese position was strong, their weapons effective, their discipline proven. A direct assault would succeed, but at a cost that might cripple the army for months to come. It was then that Genghis Khan turned to his youngest son, his eyes holding that peculiar mixture of curiosity and skepticism that fathers reserve for children who have claimed to solve problems that have stumped their elders. "You have been silent through all of this, Khazar. Do you have nothing to offer to our discussion?" The words that followed would echo through the generations, though they would be remembered differently by every man who heard them. Some would claim that Khazar spoke with the confidence of prophets, others that he stammered like a nervous boy. But the substance of what he proposed was clear enough. Give him 50 men, position them on the ridge overlooking the enemy camp, and he would demonstrate that distance was no protection when death could fly farther than any eye could see. The great Khan's response came not in words, but in a gesture, a slight nod that granted permission while promising nothing beyond the right to attempt what seemed impossible. And so it was that on the morning when the two armies drew up for battle, when horses stamped and snorted in the pre-dawn cold and warriors checked their weapons with the methodical care of men who understood that sunrise might be the last they would ever see, Khazar led his chosen archers to positions that seemed to offer nothing but the distant view of enemy preparations. The battle began, as battles always began, with the thunder of hooves and the whistle of arrows and the clash of iron against iron. The Chinese formation held steady, their crossbowmen releasing volleys that forced the Mongol cavalry to maintain greater distance than they preferred. For 2 hours, the dance of advance and retreat continued, neither side able to gain the decisive advantage that would break their opponent's line. And then, from the ridge, where 50 men lay hidden among the rocks and scrubgrass, death began to fall like rain from a cloudless sky. The first volley struck the Chinese command group at a distance so great that their guards never thought to raise shields. Arrows appeared from nowhere, materializing out of the morning air to punch through armor that had been proof against every weapon the enemy had previously faced. Generals fell without warning, standard-bearers crumpled around their banners, and panic began to spread through ranks that had never experienced attack from ranges that seemed impossible. The second volley targeted the crossbowmen, whose disciplined formations had been the backbone of Chinese resistance. Shafts launched from Khazar's impossible bows found their marks among men who thought themselves safely beyond the reach of any Mongol weapon. The careful order of their ranks dissolved as soldiers died without ever seeing their killers, struck down by arrows that seemed to fall from the sky itself. But it was the third volley that broke more than the enemy's line. It shattered every assumption about warfare that both armies had brought to the field that day, targeting the enemy's war horses at distances that defied belief. Khazar's archers began systematically dismounting the Chinese heavy cavalry, killing animals and riders with shots so precise and so impossible that veteran warriors on both sides stared at the ridge in superstitious terror. The Chinese army shattered like ice beneath a hammer. What had been a disciplined fighting force became a fleeing mob, their formation destroyed by an attack they could neither understand nor counter. The Mongol cavalry swept down upon them like wolves upon scattered sheep, but the victory belonged not to the thunder of hooves or the flash of sabers. It belonged to the silence of arrows that killed from distances no man had thought possible. In the aftermath of that battle, as the dead were counted and the wounded tended, and the wealth of a broken army was divided among the victors, Genghis Khan stood upon the ridge, where his youngest son had changed the nature of warfare itself. The great Khan's face was unreadable as stone, his dark eyes moving from the scattered enemy dead to the strange weapons that had made such slaughter possible. "You have given me a gift beyond price," he said finally, his voice carrying across the ridge where Khazar's archers waited in nervous silence. "But every gift comes with a price of its own. Do you understand what you have done this day?" Khazar met his father's gaze without flinching, though something in the Khan's tone sent ice through his veins. "I have given you victory, father. I have shown that our enemies can be reached wherever they think to hide." "You have done more than that," the great Khan replied, and now his voice carried the weight of prophecy. "You have made every fortress wall meaningless. You have rendered obsolete every defense that lesser peoples have built against us. But you have also created something that cannot be contained, cannot be controlled, cannot be recalled once it has been released into the world." The truth of those words would become clear in the days that followed, as news of the impossible battle spread through both camps. The surviving Chinese soldiers carried with them stories of arrows that flew farther than eagles, of death that struck from distances no eye could measure. But it was not only enemies who whispered in the darkness about what they had witnessed. Within the Mongol camp itself, the demonstration had unleashed forces that Khazar had never intended to awaken. His brothers, who had dismissed him as a weakling playing with toys, now saw him as a threat to their own positions. Generals who had ignored his tactical suggestions now competed for his attention. Warriors who had mocked his slight frame now watched him with the careful respect reserved for men who held the power of life and death in their hands. But it was the great Khan himself whose reaction would prove most dangerous of all. In the privacy of his tent, away from the eyes of generals and the ears of chroniclers, Genghis Khan contemplated what his youngest son had accomplished and found himself troubled by visions of a future he had not anticipated. The weapon Khazar had created was not simply an improvement upon existing technology. It was a fundamental shift in the balance between offense and defense, between the strong and the weak, between those who ruled and those who served. In the right hands, it could topple any dynasty, bring down any emperor, reduce any city to rubble from distances that rendered walls and armies and all the traditional instruments of power meaningless. But what happened when those hands belonged to subjects rather than rulers? What occurred when the technology spread beyond the Mongol camp, when enemies learned to copy what they had seen, when the secret knowledge became common wisdom? The great Khan had built his empire on the superior mobility and archery of his warriors, but Khazar's innovation threatened to democratize warfare in ways that could ultimately destroy the very foundations of Mongol supremacy. The decision was made in secret. In the dark hours before dawn, when the camp lay silent and the wind carried the scent of distant rain across the steppes, There would be no public execution, no dramatic confrontation, no clear moment when future chroniclers could point and say, "Here the fourth son fell from grace." Instead, there would be what had always served the Mongol Empire best: silence and the gradual erasure of inconvenient truths. Khazar's archers were dispersed to different units, their strange weapons confiscated for study by the Khan's personal armorer. The bowmakers who had helped in his experiments found themselves reassigned to distant campaigns. The plans and measurements that documented his innovations disappeared from their hiding places, consumed by fires that left no trace of their former existence. And Khazar himself was honored with a special mission, a diplomatic embassy to the court of the Jin dynasty, where his tactical genius would surely prove invaluable in negotiating terms favorable to the Mongol Empire. He departed the camp on a grey morning when the mist hung low over the grass. Accompanied by a small guard of picked warriors whose loyalty to the great Khan was beyond question, he was never seen again. The official records, such as they were, noted that the diplomatic mission had been successfully completed, that favorable terms had been negotiated, that all members of the embassy had died heroically during the journey home while fighting off bandits near the Gobi Desert. Their bodies were never recovered, but such was the nature of the steppes that this occasioned no particular surprise. The great Khan mourned his son's loss with appropriate dignity, and life in the camp continued much as it had before. But the soldiers remembered. In the years that followed, as the Mongol Empire expanded across continents and the sons of Genghis Khan carved their names into the chronicles of a dozen civilizations, there were always those who spoke in whispers of the battle near the Kerulan River, of arrows that flew impossible distances, of the forgotten son who had changed warfare itself in a single morning. Some claimed to have seen similar weapons in distant campaigns, exotic bows wielded by mysterious archers who appeared at crucial moments to turn the tide of battle before vanishing again into legend. Others insisted that the technology had survived in hidden forms, passed down through secret lineages of weapon makers who guarded their knowledge like the most precious treasure. Traders told stories of meeting aged warriors in far-off cities who spoke of serving under a young Mongol prince whose name had been struck from all records, whose innovations had been buried so deeply that even mentioning them was said to bring misfortune. Prisoners released from Mongol camps whispered of seeing strange bows in the hands of guards who claimed they could kill a man at distances that would make traditional archery seem like a child's game. And in the courts of China and Persia and the kingdoms of the West, military engineers attempted to replicate what spies and survivors had described, working from fragmentary accounts and half-remembered specifications to create weapons that might defend against an enemy who could strike from the edge of the visible world. But none succeeded, for the true secret had died with its creator on a road that led nowhere, in a place where the wind carries voices only the dead can hear. The great Khan had understood what his son had not, that some innovations are too dangerous for the world that created them, that some advances must be buried not out of spite or jealousy, but out of the terrible wisdom that recognizes when the cost of progress exceeds its price. The Mongol Empire would endure for generations, expanding until it stretched from the Pacific to the gates of Vienna, conquering civilizations and toppling dynasties and reshaping the map of the known world. But it would do so with traditional weapons, familiar tactics, the tried and tested methods that had served the people of the steppes since time immemorial. And in all the chronicles that recorded its triumphs, in all the histories that documented its rise and eventual decline, there would be no mention of the fourth son who had discovered how to make arrows fly like the wind itself, how to bring death from distances that seemed impossible, how to change the fundamental nature of warfare in ways that might have made the empire eternal. His name was erased so thoroughly that even the shamans forgot how to pronounce it. His innovations were buried so deeply that archaeologists would never unearth them. His story was transformed into whispered legend, into cautionary tales told around fires when the wind blew cold and the darkness seemed full of watching eyes. But listen carefully, and you can still hear echoes of what he accomplished, still catch glimpses of the truth that emperors tried so hard to destroy. In the accounts of battles where victory came too easily, where enemies fell at impossible distances, where the course of history turned on moments that chroniclers could never quite explain. In the specifications for weapons that appeared briefly in military manuals before being deleted by careful hands, in the dreams of generals who woke with visions of arrows that flew farther than eagles, only to dismiss such impossibilities in the clear light of dawn, the fourth son of Genghis Khan discovered something that would have changed the world, and the world chose to forget him rather than face the consequences of what he had revealed. His legacy lies not in monuments or chronicles, but in the silence that surrounds certain victories, in the gaps that appear between recorded facts, in the space between what happened and what history admits to remembering. And perhaps that is as it should be. For there are some secrets too dangerous for any empire to contain, some innovations too powerful for mortal rulers to control, some truths too sharp for the safety of those who would possess them. In the end, the great Khan's wisdom may have preserved more than it destroyed, burying knowledge that might have consumed the very civilization that created it. But the wind still carries whispers across the steppes, and in the dying light of empire, when shadows grow longer than the reach of any weapon, there are those who remember that once, in a time before memory, before the careful editing of chroniclers and the deliberate forgetting of inconvenient truths, a forgotten sun reached into the darkness and pulled forth lightning itself. Now you know why no historian dared to write this story, why the chronicles fell silent on the subject of the fourth son, why his name was erased with such thoroughness that even the stones forgot how to speak it. Some truths are buried not to hide shame, but to prevent the world from inheriting burdens too heavy for any generation to bear. And sometimes, in the space between what was and what might have been, we find the most dangerous knowledge of all, that progress and wisdom do not always walk the same path, and that the price of innovation may be measured not only in what we gain, but in what we must sacrifice to keep the world from burning itself to ash on the altar of its own cleverness. The steppes remember everything and nothing, holding secrets in the wind and the grass and the endless sky that watches over the graves of forgotten empires. And if you listen carefully to these words, if you can feel the weight of what has been revealed like dust settling on ancient bones, then perhaps you understand why some stories can only be told in whispers, why some truths emerge only when the sun has set, and the darkness provides cover for words too dangerous for the light of day.